You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 192 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. Today, we're heading up to Thurso in Caithness on the northernmost coast of Scotland to meet mixed farmer and 2021 Nuffield Scholar, Ranald Angus. Ranald is a partner in his family's mixed farm with beef, sheep, arable and forestry enterprises. His Nuffield focuses on carbon, and his working project title is Bridging the Carbon Divide, Marketing Soil Sequestered Carbon for Economic, Agronomic and Climatic Regeneration. So, as well as finding out a bit more about him and the family business today, I want to take the opportunity to take a deeper dive into the issue of carbon and carbon markets on farms, because, again, it's something that we skirt around the issues of on the podcast, but it's a great opportunity to dive further in. Ranald, welcome to Meet the Farmers. How's your week going? How are you doing?
Oh, Ben, yeah, not too bad so far. A bit wetter, possibly on the weather front than what I would like, but it gives me the opportunity to speak to you rather than bouncing around the tractor cab, I suppose, if you look at the upside of it.
Oh, there we are. I do remember back when we were planning this episode, and I remember sort of saying, "Well, you should probably wait for a wet week." Well, you've definitely got one of those at the moment, haven't you?
That would appear so.
So let's talk about where you are, first of all, apart from being very, very wet. Tell us about your part of the world. What's it like to live and work up there?
Yeah, certainly. Caithness is probably a place that most of your listeners will be wondering, where on earth is that? The way I always describe it to people is it's as far north as you can go on the British mainland without getting wet. So we are on the very northern tip of Scotland. And as far as the situation goes, we would be approximately closer to the Arctic Circle than we would be to London. So we're quite far north. We've got a relatively good climate for farming, although we do have a short season. Weather, we will have water on our side in the sense that we have plenty of it, which will be an advantage going forward in the future, possibly. But generally, that makes it a challenge. It's not so much perhaps the level of water that you receive, it's the fact that you can have quite a lot of sort of damp air that doesn't lend itself to drying out. You've got quite a short growing season. You probably do the bulk of your growing in a sort of 5-month period of the year. So yes, it's got its challenges, but equally it does have potentially, I would say, quite a lot of opportunities going forward. The type of farming here would be pretty traditional. It would be generally livestock based, although there's a lot more arable now than there historically has been. And certainly you are limited by that growing season and climate. You know, we're not going to be growing maize or anything like that anytime soon. So you maybe don't have the decisions that other growers would have as to what they're going to be putting in the ground, because you have a sort of limited number of options. That said, it is a very beautiful part of the world. The two main towns that we have, Wick and Thurso, they're both Viking settlements. So, you know, there's quite a long history. Sort of farming and fishing would be the mainstay of that up until about the 19th century. There was a lot of export of Caithness stone, which is it was used as a building material around the world. You can go a lot of places, London, New York, you'll find Caithness stone was exported around the world because it was a very durable, and it's quite a square stone, so it lends itself well to building. And then in the 20th century, there was a big change in the direction of where Caithness went from a kind of sort of quiet farming and fishing town. We were chosen to have the site of an experimental nuclear facility.
Of course.
And that heralded the kind of atomic era, which brought a vast influx of people into the county. At one point in time, Caithness had more graduates per head of population than Oxford and Cambridge. So there was a wealth of knowledge and talent, if you like, came into the county in pursuit of new highly paid jobs to run a new type of nuclear power known as the fast reactor, which was an experimental thing that was done in the 1950s until it was decommissioned or started decommissioning. Then that round about the early 90s, I think. Engineering and the associated industries is quite prevalent here still today.
I mean, just returning to farming and just trying to understand a little bit about, I suppose, the context of the climate with you. I mean, last summer, clearly for most people, was very dry, very early harvest. When were you starting harvest and when were you finishing?
So last year was a relatively good season. Harvest up here would be on the later end. A lot of our cropping locally is spring cropping, although there are some people who grow winter cereals. We grow a little bit of winter barley. There's a small amount of wheat, but not a lot. And that would technically kick off around mid-August, sort of start of August. And then the main bit of the harvest would be done then in September, harvesting generally spring barley or spring oats. So it's a lot later than the other parts of the world. We have a short growing season, and the daylight hours in summer kind of compensate for the fact that you've got a shorter growing season. So in the height of summer, you probably get a kind of twilight where you maybe only have really an hour of darkness, in the kind of summer solstice. So, but the converse then in the winter solstice, when you have, the sort of week before Christmas, you will be looking at darkness being from probably about 4 o'clock at night through to possibly even 8 o'clock in the morning, or maybe even it can feel a bit darker. Even if you get a cloudy day, it might not feel as if you're getting much daylight at all really through the day. Because we are obviously quite far north.
How long has your family been farming up there?
Oh, a good while. The business in its current form was started by my grandfather, so that's 3 generations, and there'll probably be a couple of generations before that. So a reasonable amount of time, I would have thought. I mean, most farming families up here would be pretty similar. They would have quite a long tradition of, if not being in the same farm, then being in farms in the locality.
Have you got many tenancies in your part of the world?
Yeah, there are a few back and forth. There's not really any sort of large estates as such, so it's a small area, if you like. The farm size could vary from anything to below sub 100 acres up into several thousand acres. The farms that are in the larger end, they would probably have quite a mixture of types of land. They would probably have a lot of poor peatland ground virgin to the best of arable ground, because there's a real mix of in the type of sort of land and topography that we have here. It's generally very flat. I mean, when you tell people that you're in the absolute north of Scotland, they automatically assume that it's kind of like an episode of Outlander type of thing. But the reality of it is that Caithness is quite flat, and you can see for quite a long distance away because of the fact that it's flat. And Caithness is often referred to as the lowland beyond the highlands. You can see probably in a given point, you could be looking 40, possibly 30, 40 miles in a given direction on a clear day, because the fact you can in some points of the county you can virtually see nearly all around you. Wow. So it's quite a nice place when the weather's nice. Some very scenic views and some quite spectacular skylines. We have some nights you can see the northern lights and these type of things. And it's definitely there's worse places to live in the world, put it like that. Although you are perhaps a bit remote because of the fact that you're 2.5 hours by car away from Inverness. It always makes me laugh when people regard the likes of maybe Manchester as being the north, but the reality is Even to go to Inverness, there's an assumption that you get there and fall off a cliff, but the reality is there's some 100 miles plus that you can venture, and in that space there's still a lot to see and a lot to take in.
This episode is being supported by our primary sponsor, A-Plan Rural. Why did I want to collaborate with A-Plan Rural? Well, having got to know them, their team shares my passion for giving a voice to farmers, and we are both driven to raise the profile of farming voices to a wider audience. So it seemed quite a good fit. Quite frankly, together we will be able to do a lot more. A-Plan Rural do a lot of work on social media themselves, sharing farming accounts and farming stories. They have a rural community blog which shares farmers' experiences, and they also support a growing number of initiatives that champion UK farmers, including this podcast. So a big thank you to A-Plan Rural for supporting Meet the Farmers. What was it like growing up on the farm?
I would probably say that in those days it was a simpler time, I guess. The modern world is quite complex, and there was something to be said for, just kind of being allowed to be in that environment and being trusted with a job and just sort of go and get on with it, like driving machinery and things. It was just kind of accepted that at 8 years old you were going to learn to drive a Land Rover, and at 10 or 12 years old, you'd be learning to drive a tractor, whereas obviously nowadays the health and safety implication maybe dissuades people away from that. But I think it's a healthy environment to grow up in. Obviously it's a good lesson in life to go into young farmers then is a good kind of education in life. There's a lot of life lessons to be learned there. So yeah, I would say there's definitely an element of, that was definitely a different time. Nowadays, the pressures that modern businesses are under, and that, to do as much as can be done with the labour requirement that you have. And I would say the weather is an element of that too. When I was at school, it's maybe just a touch of nostalgia, but it seems to be that the summers were long and hot, and jobs got done in good time and everything, whereas now you seem to be always chasing to beat the weather, to beat the rain, or to get a job done before things start to turn nasty. Whereas in those days, it just seems that you had weekends off. Whereas now, I guess you're trying to do more and more and more to try and sort of stand still, which I think in the long run in farming is probably a bad thing. But for the meantime anyway, it's the direction of travel that seems to be. You have to have a certain amount of scale about you. Certainly, if you're doing a conventional model of agriculture, if you're working on a value-added product basis or a diversification basis, is slightly different. But I think for most people that would regard themselves as bread and butter farmers, it seems to be more and more and more onus on the shoulders of less and less people, which I think is a bad thing. But certainly in those days, it was all very interesting to get involved with. You were entrusted with things, and I guess if you made a mistake, there wasn't the financial sort of consequence that there was now. If something happened and got broken, you just put it down to a lesson in life. Whereas now, if something gets broken or something,
quite a bit more expensive.
Absolutely, aye. But there's no better way of learning than learning through your mistakes. I would be the first person to advocate that. But I would still say that a farming upbringing is a good grounding in life, regardless as to whether you decide to ultimately pursue a career in farming or you decide to do something else in the world. Because certainly in our area, obviously, as I've said, engineering is one of the prevalent industries, and certainly people who recruit for engineering, they are very adamant or very keen to get people from a farming background because of the aptitude that they have and the kind of work ethic that has been installed into them from an upbringing in agriculture. So I wouldn't say that it's done me any harm anyway, or certainly none that I can vouch for anyway.
Like I say, not that we're trying to lose anyone from agriculture already, but it is a good point, isn't it? For someone from a farming background going into any other area, there is that sort, even just the work ethic, just that sort of idea that you will graft, you will get this done. and also the problem solving as well. So I think people from farming background have all those other skills. You mentioned young farmers, of course, which has been a big part of your life. Tell us a bit about your local club.
There are 3 young farmers clubs in Caithness, Forest, Bower and Halkirk. And have always been a staunch member of Bower Young Farmers. I joined when I was 13 years old and got thrown in at the deep end. In those days, it wasn't a case of being asked to go to things. You were just simply told you are going to do this, whatever it was. If it was curling or football or agri skills or stock judging, you were just told, you will be picked up, you will go. And I think it was quite good because it was at that age, you're maybe a bit shy as to going in with all the other sort of older members of your club. So obviously in Scotland, young farmers kind of stands from sort of 13 or 14 through to 30. So you kind of get a range of kind of people in that. And, I've kind of done most things. I've competed at club, regional, national levels, having done various degrees of success in each of those kind of levels that I've competed at. And I guess most notable achievements for me in 2009, I was the National Member of the Year, quite possibly the youngest member ever to do it at 19. And
wow.
I don't think there's been anybody, possibly I could be wrong, but I think there's been nobody that young since or before. And then in 2016...
That's quite an accolade.
Yeah.
It's quite impressive.
I guess. And then in 2016, I was very proud to be part of a team of people who managed to achieve winning the National Club of the Year for Bower. And it was great because, we had come on such a long way. When I first joined, the club had a negative bank balance, and I would say it was a relatively good membership, but it wasn't maybe the strongest club. Certainly the club to beat at that time was Halkirk. They had all the members, they were winning all the trophies, but every dog has its day, and we slowly built the club up over time to the point that we had a very healthy bank balance. We had a very successful run at competitions. We had a diverse age group of members, which is always an important thing because you've got to have sort of everybody at every stage to have a level of continuation in young farmers. And, we had moved forward a lot as a club, and that recognition then was rewarded in 2016 by winning the National Club of the Year. And everybody sort of immediately looked to me at the time to sort of give a speech at the Royal Highland Show when we won it. And I was more than proud to stand in front of everybody and tell them that obviously young farmers is another thing that Caithness has kind of given the world. If you like, the Scottish Association of Young Farmers has its origins founded in Caithness in a kind of a pig fattening competition that was held on a farm. And from that, then a number of clubs eventually formed, and then the Scottish Association was born. So I was more than delighted to stand up in front of my peers and tell them that Bower Young Farmers, which I think was about the second club to be formed, was one of the original clubs and was still very much one of the best.
Let's go back to your family business. When did you first get involved? Because you've been involved for years, obviously, since a young age. But in terms of the actual business, and when did you become a partner?
Obviously, as we touched on, I grew up, went to school, sort of in the sort of 90s into the 2000s, and at that time, farming was going through quite a bad spell. Obviously, we had BAT and foot and mouth. Kind of depressed commodity prices. It wasn't particularly a bed of roses to be involved in agriculture at that time. And, my father and my mother were very much of the opinion that I should go and do something else. So when I was selecting my subjects for the school, I decided that I was going to go and study engineering. So I selected subjects that sort of aligned with things that I liked, and equally was things that were, sort of aptitudes that would be preferable for going into engineering. So I was very lucky when I left the school at 16. I was given a engineering apprenticeship in mechanical engineering with Rolls-Royce, and it had been a long-held ambition of mine when I was very young that I would go and design cars. I still do have a sort of fascination with cars, but I've always had a fascination with cars. And I was awarded an apprenticeship with Rolls-Royce, but unfortunately it was to work on nuclear submarines, so it was close but no cigar.
Right.
So I did 4 years of an engineering apprenticeship, and then I did a little spell after that in doing operations. And then after a number of years then doing that, I decided in 2011 that I would go to New Zealand and do a kind of working holiday. So I went out to New Zealand and worked with agricultural contractors out there and had a fantastic time, met a lot of interesting people. The thing about contracting is you obviously have to turn up to a farm to go and do that. And obviously you get the farmer comes to show you whatever it is you're doing. If you're drilling maize or rowing up silage or whatever it is, he always comes, shows you the field, and usually get a kind of bit of a chin wag with him. And it was a great way of going into farms, learning things, seeing systems, and obviously getting a few beers and seeing a bit of the New Zealand countryside as well. So I did that for 9 months, and then when I came back then in 2012, I am now about 11 years into my life sentence, I guess you could say.
It is one way of putting it. Tell us more about the farm. So, I mean, you are a proper mixed farm with mixed enterprises, including forestry as well, which obviously maybe more so up in Scotland, but a proper mixed farm.
Yeah, so we would be fairly conventional. You have beef suckler cows, breeding ewes. We grow a mixture of cereals. We grow some winter barley that we use predominantly for our own use for livestock feed. And then the rest of the grain that we grow is gluten-free milling oats, spring oats. And we have a bit of forestry as well. There's quite a lot of land in Caithness that is put down to forestry. There was a kind of period where there was grants at the time to do that type of thing, because there was a need at that time for planting trees. It's a slightly different land use, I suppose, but I guess it's at the time it was making use of what was available, the best resource, I guess, or the best use of the land, that type of land at that time. We're certainly not doing anything that defies convention in our part of the world. I like to try and do as good a job as I can. I try and embrace new techniques and technology as best as I can. Within that, the family partnership, my grandfather, my brother, my uncle, my father, and myself, we all have our own kind of bit that we do. And my main bit is kind of doing the arable side of it, and also obviously having an engineering background, a lot of maintenance and repairs and things. And yeah, it's maybe not just groundbreaking exactly, but I think within quite a traditional model of farming, I try and be as progressive and forward looking as I can be in order to try and stay ahead of the curve, as it were, which is difficult in a part of say it's difficult, but it's certainly maybe harder to try and do in a part of the world where the farming itself is more difficult. It's always been said that, you could take somebody out of Caithness and make them a farmer anywhere type of thing, because, the challenge is just greater. I mean, what you were saying earlier, Ben, about problem solving and things, I mean, for us, next day parts is not necessarily a given. Certainly same day is out of the question. So sometimes we have to try and think outside of the box as to how you can maybe keep a machine going enough that you can tide it over, because not only can you not afford to wait 4 parts, but like the season is so short that if you have good days, you need to be going.
Yeah.
So you need to have a kind of mindset of not sort of rolling over and giving up. You have to have a mindset of always trying to push and to think outside the box. And if it doesn't have, if it doesn't look very pretty, doesn't matter, as long as it works and keeps you going. That's what matters.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, mindset. Yeah, driven by your own landscape. I want to talk about. I think I'm going to talk about future of the farm at the end because you are going through your Nuffield, and I'm assuming that as you go through the process of this, your thinking is probably going to change as well. Who knows? But let's turn to your Nuffield. Why did you want to do it in the first place, and have you always wanted to do one?
My experience of Nuffield came about firsthand through young farmers when I was asked to be, I guess, a sort of ambassador for young farmers and going and attending a Nuffield conference in Glasgow. So I didn't know an awful lot about Nuffield. I'd heard the title banded about, and I'd sort of had a little bit of understanding that it was a scholarship, that you went away and studied something and it involved a bit of travel, and that the conference would be free. So those two things intrigued me greatly. So I went away and went to a conference in Glasgow, and I was completely blown away by the talent and the mentality and the attitude of the people that were there. There's lots of organisations that try to do good for farming and for farmers, but I guess the thing really for me about Nuffield was just the rapport that was in the room. You attend some of these types of conferences and there's doom and gloom, and it's the government's fault that we're in this position, and we've got to like get the consumers to kind of stand up for us, and all these type of messages. But the message I got from Nuffield, the type of people that were there, it didn't matter what was thrown at them. It didn't matter. Like, they weren't interested in government policy. They weren't interested in supply chain issues, or it just didn't matter to them. Whatever came down the track, they were going to deal with it. They were going to find the opportunities. They were going to adapt and progress in a way that meant that their businesses were going to flourish. And it was that mindset and that attitude, and it wasn't just, some of these things, you read an article in a magazine and it says, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that and we're going to do the next. And you think, oh, that's great. And then you read about 4 columns down, oh, well, we hope to be making a profit by, 2025 or something. But generally, a lot of these Nuffield people, they are successful in their own right, because they have, through the connections they've made and the knowledge that they've learned, managed to progress their businesses. And not all the businesses are particularly big or flash. I mean, you have some examples of some very big businesses in that, but equally, you've got some very small artisan businesses that equally make a very good profit for what they're doing and are industry leaders in their own field. To me, it was that sense of progression and, the kind of mindset of sort of getting on with it and coming up with the answers. That was the thing that really, really inspired me. So I decided then I was going to go and do a Nuffield, and I had just kind of come out of young farmers then. I'd reached the ripe old age of 30, where you had to kind of gracefully stand aside. So I decided that the time was right to think about a Nuffield, and I started into doing my application in 2020. And
I was going to say it was the COVID year.
Yeah, so that was probably the catalyst, Ben, that actually made me recommit to it and decide, yes, I'm going to do this. Because obviously, like most farmers, you're pretty busy. You work maybe longer hours than most. So therefore, I had to be fairly confident that I would be able to do the thing the justice that it deserved, not only for my own part, but obviously because it's a very fierce selection process. So if you are fortunate enough to be awarded one, you have to obviously do it justice, because there are equally a lot of people who have not had the opportunity. So you don't want to obviously, go in there and make a hash of it when somebody else potentially had the opportunity to do the thing justice. So I knew that there would be an element of flexibility with COVID, with travelling, because obviously the whole world ground to a halt in March of 2020. So that gave me the confidence that there would be flexibility to go about traveling and, to have a bit more time, which is the way that things have panned out now. I won't be presenting this coming year, but I will be presenting in 2024. I've probably done about 25% of my travel, and that's probably purposeful because I've been kind of sitting back and watching what is going on with this carbon thing, because obviously it's a fairly new concept. Certainly when I was initially awarded my scholarship, you had to sit down people and explain to them this concept of marketing soil sequestered carbon. And then come a full year gone past, I attended Cereal's event in 2021. And when you explained to people then some 10 months after being awarded my scholarship what you were doing, people looked at you like you had discovered fire. Whereas before they kind of looked at you with a kind of confused look as if to say, what's that all about type of thing. But
it sounds a bit like explaining podcasts, to be honest.
Well, I guess with the passage of time, something, if it is going to grow arms and legs, it kind of cements itself as a more mainstream thing. And I guess the carbon thing has kind of got to the stage now where it's maybe not quite mainstream, but it's certainly more accepted as being, a kind of more a slightly more mainstream practice. And we probably have a bit to go yet, certainly, but initially everybody's excited about the hype about how they can monetize something that I guess the attraction is in farming. We're always price takers and not price makers, and a lot of that is because we have to sell a product which is a perishable good, be it milk or grain or meat or whatever it is. It has a certain shelf life, whereas I guess the attraction with carbon is that it's something which never leaves a farm and doesn't have an expiry date. I mean, the whole purpose of the thing is that it's going to stay there and not go anywhere. So I guess that side of it is a bit of a game changer as opposed to the more traditional forms of agriculture where, come a certain date, you have to offload your wares at whatever the market is doing.
Yeah. And was that part of the element? I'm just trying to understand out of all the things, because I mean, clearly with your background as well, out of all the things you could have focused on, why carbon markets?
There's part of me that says, if I was to stand in front of a Nuffield panel and tell them that I want to understand how I can grow 4 ton of spring oats in the county of Caithness, I probably wouldn't be awarded a Nuffield Scholarship, although it's something that would probably interest me greatly. I think there has to be an element of doing something which is relative, but at the same time is maybe like a new interest. And this is something going forward now, this transition to net zero type of deal, it is going to impact on us some way or another, whether it be in the cost of the things that we buy or in the overall running of our businesses. Will we have some sort of tax placed on us if we're not doing things that are kind of seen as an environmentally good practice or whatever, however you want to look at it, it will have a bearing in the future. And I was just lucky that I'm very interested in looking at agricultural trends and where we're going in the future and this type of thing. And it's just something that I had identified as being probably something that would potentially have quite a big impact on us going forward. And equally, because it was new and interesting, it was something out with the regular kind of form of agriculture that was, I guess, just a more of an interesting thing to study, I suppose.
Next one is, I mean, it's an impossible question in some ways, but what is your assessment of carbon market opportunities for farmers in the UK at the moment? So what are those opportunities? How many farmers are actually engaging with them? And I suppose here I'm talking about compliance markets for energy intensive industries and the voluntary markets. So just the system as a whole.
It's a very difficult thing to actually get a proper outcome on. But I mean, essentially, the goal in the future is to achieve net zero. So quite simply, the amount of carbon that your business generates needs to be balanced out that you don't produce any emissions. That's the idea of it. So if you're manufacturing steel and you've done all the mitigation that you can, you maybe have renewable energy for powering your plants or whatever you've done, eventually the mitigation gets to a point where you still have a surplus of carbon that is either going to be taxed, or you need to sort of promote an activity that removes carbon.
Yeah.
So obviously there is a lot of talk about carbon removal technology, which is a long way away and it's quite expensive, and no doubt that technology will progress and probably improve and get cheaper. But we as farmers can do the same thing, and all we need is sunlight and green leaves. Plants obviously naturally sequester, or carbon is locked up in them as part of the growing cycle. So the theory is, obviously, if we can put that carbon in the soil, then we're going to have a carbon store going forward. Now, in the UK, there has been a bit of activity around this fairly recently, and there's been a number of people who have set up ISO accredited carbon trading schemes, and some of them are maybe not even as straightforward as there maybe even isn't a computation really as such done on that. It's basically done on the fact that if you do a practice X, the amount of carbon that will be sequestered will be Y, and therefore we will pay you for that activity, and a kind of carbon credit is kind of generated on that basis. And it's a kind of rough rule of thumb way of doing things. Whether that holds any water going forward in the future as to a carbon offset or not will remain to be seen. But at the moment, because it's voluntary, which is quite important to understand, because the government, the whole net zero target, how we actually achieve net zero, there's lots of things that are too variable just now to really pinpoint. But ultimately, the companies that are doing it, they're doing it probably more so from a marketing perspective, that they can turn around to their customers and give an impression that they care about environmental sustainability, they care about what they're doing and how they conduct their business. And there is a school of thought backed by science that the more net worth that people have as individuals, or the more disposable net worth they have, the higher up the order ranking that like your carbon footprint and your environmental sustainability is. So certainly on companies that have a higher value product, that's a more profound thing than others, because the carbon market is really made up of lots of types of offsets, and certainly some of them are very dubious as to whether that actually results in any kind of environmental benefit, because a lot of these things are very dubious, and they maybe would tick a box for accountancy purposes, but the types of credits that British farmers are producing would be on the higher value end. We could say that these companies are probably purchasing maybe 90% kind of dubious credits, and then they maybe top them up with 10% of real quality credits, if you like, that tell a story, that they can then kind of use that as the punchline, and then the rest of it kind of just makes up for the kind of accountancy figures. I think that's a fairly broad brush perspective of things as they're operating at the moment. The problem is with a carbon offset is knowing how long it's going to actually be there, and the types of offsetting that are being done, direct drilling and these types of regenerative agriculture, if you like, they're probably the ones that are the most popular just now, and again worked on a kind of models approach that if you do 10 years of direct drilling, your soil organic matter will raise by a certain profile, and therefore we can translate that into carbon. But I mean, ultimately what we're really looking at in carbon is stabilized carbon, because carbon has many forms in the soil, and some of that carbon is obviously cycled back again as part of the growing cycle. So the real holy grail we're looking for here is a kind of stabilized carbon. And looking forward, I'm really thinking just now, although that thinking process might change, that the real kind of holy grail there is probably in some kind of microbial carbon stabilization, if you like. Okay. So we know that in arable land, the amount of carbon that is in the soil is much less than it is in a grassland scenario. And in that scenario, it's the kind of the pasture type environment that has allowed for a higher organic matter to be accumulated. And a lot of that, I think, the understanding of it is probably the bit at the moment that most of the attention is being focused on in the science to try and understand how that is. Because if you compare an arable scenario, the maximum amount of carbon that you can sort of find in that environment, you could be looking at 100 tons a hectare, rough maths, that if you manage to hold on to all the carbon that was there. And then if you go to a pastoral environment, you immediately go to about 250 tons per hectare. And then if you go into a forest environment, you would assume that would be a higher value. But the reality is actually that the pastoral-based system is very comparable to forestry. It's approximately 250 tons of carbon per hectare. So the understanding then around the soil science and about how that's achieved start to become quite interesting. And in terms of where we're going as farmers as well in the long run, obviously carbon sequestration is just one part of the overall picture of the many things that we consider as farmers. But I think some of the exciting stuff that I'm seeing at the moment is the fact that we maybe are progressing to a more microbial way of farming. For example, perhaps relying less on things that come out of cans and bags in the long run. So I guess it's not just one. You make the folly of concentrating on carbon. Obviously, if you think, well, in the future, that's where the money's going to be. We could be looking at, $100 a ton plus for carbon. And if you look at the tons of carbon the industry needs to be generating, it's absolutely massive. So if they have to go out and offset all of that carbon, it's potentially a massive market. So then if that's where the money is, that's where the thought gets trained into, because it's like, well, if we've got this thing that can generate a lot of money, that's what we want to pay all our attention to. But the fact is, it's more than that. I mean, there's not many things in farming where it all comes down to just like one thing, and soil is probably one of the most complex things you will ever comprehend. Even the amount that we know about it now, as in science, as an industry or as a scientific study, is probably not even scratching the surface. And that's the thing with carbon sequestration and understanding how plants and soils kind of talk to one another, and you've got all this kind of microbial activity going on under your feet. The interplay between all of that and how we can influence that. The old soil science doesn't help you there. It's a new understanding of soil science that will ultimately, I think, be the thing that provides a lot of the solutions that we're really looking for. And we are probably heading to a direction of travel in the future where what is below our feet is probably going to be of greater interest than probably what is above our feet.
Just a little more about our primary sponsor, A-Plan Rural. They provide bespoke insurance cover for farms and estates. This could be for anything from tractors and machinery to a new exciting diversification venture. So for more information, visit aplan.co.uk/rural. That's aplan.co.uk/rural. On the market side, are there, and this might actually relate to where you're traveling to actually, are there any particular countries that are further ahead than others in terms of level of establishment?
Initially, I went to Germany. They've done a lot of things. The Germans are kind of a bit different in the way they approach things. They're very kind of technically driven. They do things very thoroughly. They have quite a structured kind of process of how they examine things. They've got a lot of, particularly in agriculture, a very organised sector in Germany. They've got lots of bodies and technical institutes that all look at various studies of disciplines within farming. And I went there initially because there was some thinking around the idea of producing a compost that, through the kind of process of making this compost, would produce a kind of a brown coal, if you like. So it's like a properly stabilized form of carbon that you would basically have to dig it out the ground. Once it's there type of thing. But the problem with that is that, yes, you can get stabilized carbon, but the amount of stabilized carbon that you get in that composting process relative to the carbon that you've lost during the process of composting kind of makes it that it's not really, I guess, a thing that kind of has yielded much fruit. If you can achieve a similar type of thing, maybe within the soil itself, that might be possibly a kind of holy grail as to where, things might potentially have some breakthroughs on that in the future. But, that was initial thinking. And, I went to Germany and met quite a lot of very interesting, very forward-thinking people. And I came across a company that was doing biochar, and they were kind of doing a deal where you would kind of get this biochar for free if they kind of got the carbon credits back then to trade into industry. And that was quite interesting because, I mean, just now where fertilizer prices have been recently, I'm pretty sure if you went to your average farmer and said, look, I'll give you free fertilizer if you give me your carbon credits, the reality is they'd probably chew the hand off you right now. Whether that's a wise thing in the future or not, who knows? But it's certainly something that is being done at the moment in Germany and across the world, then in Australia and America, as in the USA. They're very active in their pursuit of carbon farming. And you'll notice that it's all the big companies, big agrochemical companies that have automatically jumped on the bandwagon. And I think there is a pitfall there that farmers are backed into a corner where they're told they have to hand over some of their natural capital in order to, meet a supermarket contract or something of that ilk. And I think that's potentially a very dangerous position to be in the future, because some of these things potentially will have a lot more value in the future than they currently do now. Some farmers might be kind of pressurized into underselling an asset. It's certainly been something that's been bandied about fairly recently. So that's maybe one danger that maybe lurks on the horizon at the moment. But yeah, certainly there are programs out there to try and pursue this, and there's lots of ways of doing it, and nobody really has a definitive, one size fits all answer, which on the one hand is there's a lot to go on it, but at the same time it makes it a very interesting time to sit and study it from my perspective. And in the time that I've been looking at it, which has been a number of years now, from when I was first awarded my scholarship, the thinking around it and the way that it's evolved has been interesting to watch. And I think not just in carbon, but also in the whole farming thing is in general. I've maybe possibly taken a little bit of a back seat on the carbon journey to try and understand, because there's this thing about Nuffield that, yes, go and study your subject, but equally go and study a whole lot of interesting things that revolve around that subject as well.
Yeah.
And, I think between Brexit and the whole COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine now, I think we're at a real kind of crossroads as to where we're going in farming in the future. And the really burning question that I'm asking myself is, where ultimately are we going in the future as farmers? Because I think this next period of 10 years from 2020 up to 2030 is going to see some much more significant change in the world and in farming as a consequence than we've seen maybe in the last decade, from say 2010 up to 2019, end of 2019, 2020. So to witness that and have access to some of the influential thinkers, or some of the more, I guess, kind of radical thinkers on that as well, is interesting. And it's certainly the Nuffield association, as in the Nuffield kind of brand, if you like, that gets you the access to these people. Because, I'm pretty sure if I just knocked on their door and said, "Hello, I'm a farmer from Caithness, would you mind entertaining me for half a day to tell me all about your business and all about your thought rationale on the future of farming and carbon," they'd probably tell you, "Sorry, my diary's full." But when you come with the Nuffield, waving the Nuffield banner, that puts a slightly different connotation on it, and you're usually kind of welcomed in and given a more in-depth analysis of things than what you would have done as just a kind of a member of the general farming community.
Yeah, well, I think when you do eventually present, it's going to be a fascinating report. So yeah, I for one am looking forward to reading that one. We're going to have to start to round things up because yeah, time is against us. So I'm going to finish with the last two questions, which I ask everyone before the end of the show. The first is, what is your message to the public? If you have any message, what would it be?
The public need to probably appreciate the way the world is changing right now, that food is no longer a given. There's some very big pressures in the world right now surrounding food. And I think that the cost of food is generally far too cheap for the work and for the risk that goes into producing it. And that, there is probably a change on the horizon now, that food is probably not going to be as readily available and is probably going to cost a bit more. I mean, we're seeing just even now the impacts that we've had, as I've talked about, between Brexit, COVID, and the war in Ukraine. We're probably heading to a more, or I guess, a less globalized world. Globalization is a thing that we've taken for granted for a very long time. And that is starting to be tested now. And, the daily essentials of, buying your milk and bread and all your other groceries are going to be put under great pressure. So I think there's going to be a significant change going forward. We probably won't have the same amount of cheap food available that there has been. So I think the public kind of need to be aware of that, because it is something that is probably coming down the track fairly soon. Well, it's starting to filter through now, but yeah, I think it'll be more prevalent in years to come.
And your message to farmers?
Message to farmers, I guess, would be always embrace the opportunity to travel. So, as I've said, I've done traveling through young farmers. I've done a number of study tours. One of them was to Argentina, and as I've said, I've been out to New Zealand of my own accord, and now I'm doing a Nuffield Scholarship. And certainly, to travel around the world and see other farms and see other ideas and see other ways of thinking should always be embraced. And I know it's difficult sometimes to get off of farm, because you always feel that there's always something needing to be done, and there's always something that is always holding you back. But if you can get away and look at things from a different perspective, you don't necessarily have to have the benefit of a Nuffield Scholarship. It's always good if that's available to you. But if you can just go, even to go down the road to another farm along the road and see how they do things, farmers are generally quite open, and they will tell you the successes and the failures of what they're doing. And you find if you go around the world, the problems are the same. I mean, the farming might be incredibly different, but you find that it's quite the same. It's weather, it's politics, it's disease. All these things are the same, but yet they can be on the other side of the world in a totally different environment and a totally different context altogether. But yet it's always the same type of thing. So to go and learn that and see that is always beneficial. So I would advocate anybody, if you get an opportunity to go and travel and see other farming businesses, that you should take that opportunity with both hands.
Yeah, that's such a good point. They are the same challenges. Your recommendation for a blog, podcast, or social media account to follow, and that can be farming or non-farming?
Yeah, I guess I spend a lot of time in a tractor, so I listen to a lot of podcasts. I know
I'd like to hear
everybody.
that. That's good.
I know everybody raves about the high performance podcast. I've not actually listened to that yet, but it seems to be one that everybody goes on about.
Do it.
But certainly, I listen to Pasture Pod, which is quite good. The Pub Yields podcast. I think it's very important that you have an element of not being drilled into just serious stuff the whole time. Sometimes things that are quite stupid are quite good as well. I'm listening to the Kite Podcast, Ben. I'm not in the milk environment, but some of the things are applicable, sort of thing.
You can
Maybe
still
one
be
day
part of Team Dairy. It's fine. You can still be part of Team Dairy if you're not a dairy farmer.
Well, you never know, Ben. One day I might be milking oats yet. I don't know how big a parlour I'll need, but it might happen. And well, I guess I listen to quite a lot on YouTube. I'll quite often get involved, and there's quite interesting things on there. I'm a bit of a YouTube addict. There's all kinds of things. In fact, it's at the stage that I would far rather sit down and watch stuff on YouTube than I would sit down and watch the TV. Some of the things you can find are very informational, and you can glean a lot from that, I feel.
No, big time. And finally, I suppose, other than wait for your Nuffield report and read that, how can people sort of engage with the stuff that you're doing?
I've not got much in the way of social media. I do have an Instagram page that I probably don't update all that regularly, and I have LinkedIn. But certainly the Nuffield website is always updated with the latest reports. And again, you can find a lot of the presentations on YouTube from the conferences. And anybody who's looking to take on a scholarship or think about it, they should definitely there'll be someone probably in your area that'll point in the right direction, and if not, the Nuffield website is always a great source of information into where to start thinking and start looking for ideas of what you might consider as a topic.
Well, Ranald, thank you so much for your time. You're a busy man, so I really appreciate you coming on here. And it's just been great to have a small insight into your mind and everything you've got going on and your thoughts about ag going forward. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem, Ben.
That is it for today. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Next week, we'll be on the Isle of Man with Harry and Ian Parsons. And on the Rural Business Focus podcast this week, we're talking about tech and digital and the future potential for digital in the rural space. Thanks again to Ranald for today and to our primary podcast sponsor, A-Plant Rural Insurance, for supporting the show. Please see the show notes for more information and for any links mentioned today. For now, though, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great week.